In the summer of 1970, Andrew Lloyd Webber, Tim Rice, and their team finished recording the double album Jesus Christ Superstar in Olympic Studios in London. The team was an eclectic mix of orchestral, gospel, rock, and musical theater talent, brought together by Webber and Rice, whose success working on Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat had opened the door to explore increasingly ambitious projects. Superstar, with its genre-bending blend of contemporary psychedelic rock elements and traditional orchestration, represented a leap into uncharted territory. Although the rock opera had already been established as a format, in fact, Superstar was preceded just the year before by The Who's Tommy, it had yet to be proved on Broadway and the West End. Among the diverse vocal talent recruited for the project was Ian Gillan, who had recently become the lead singer of Deep Purple, at that time a moderately successful British rock band who eventually went on to crack the international top 10 charts several times throughout the 70s. Gillan, who portrayed Jesus, supposedly recorded the entirety of his vocals in 3 hours, although the only source I can find for this is his own autobiography. Somewhere in the course of those 3 hours, he dropped this distinctive wail that would come to take on a life and legacy of its own. A few years later, American actor Ted Neely, who replaced Gillan as the lead in the movie version of Superstar, standardized this note into its current iconic form, leading to a legacy of Y attempts, both successful and failed. With its insane jump to G5, a note that we hardly ever see in male vocal notation, and its distinctive style, this note has built something of a reputation as potentially the hardest note on Broadway. Countless performers have crushed it, and countless others have opted out of the note, bringing great shame upon themselves in the process. While others have added flavor to the riff to increase its difficulty. This note ultimately inspired a series I started on TikTok in 2023 called Is This the Hardest Note on Broadway?, which covered candidates for potentially the most difficult notes that we see in musical theater. So is it? Well, it depends on who you ask. Vocal demands vary so much by gender, voice type, and experience with particular genres that it's essentially impossible to answer this question. However, I do think that the conversation around this note encapsulates the discussion between vocal athleticism and artistry in musical theater. Under nearly every video that I've put out in the series, there's been at least one comment saying that the emphasis on high, difficult notes actually takes away from musical theater as an art form. Many claimed that this was a recent trend, indicative of a musical theater culture spiraling towards out-of-control tenordom. So what role do impressive notes play in making compelling theater? How does musical theater's relationship with genre shape the demands that it puts upon its singers? And finally, has musical theater become more vocally demanding over time, hurting its artistry and its performers? To answer these questions, we're gonna have to rewind the clock over 2 centuries to explore the origins of musical theater itself. In the early 17th century, opera, which had been an art form reserved mostly for court entertainment, went public. From the outset, it was a genre prone to high drama, emotional intensity, and importantly for our discussion here, scrutiny as to its proper form. According to historian Tim Carter, few genres were from the outset subject to such intense theorizing about their reason for being. Okay, so opera is classy and whatever, but I am not going to be able to pronounce this French. Raison d'être? I don't know, reason for being. The self-examination characteristic of opera up to the present day began early in its history. It raised crucial problems concerning the aims and effects of music, drama, and the arts in general that could not be ignored. While music has been part of theater for thousands of years, opera was subject to a particularly heated discourse, as well as an intense commitment to particular forms of vocal excellence. In the early years of opera, for example, an intense focus on high notes led to most of the leads being taken by either female sopranos or male castrati, which reflects the lengths the culture was willing to go to just to hit some cool high notes. Look, so I know the castrati actually brings up some complicated issues of class and consent, but just imagine the commitment of cutting your balls off to sound like Aaron Tveit. That's commitment. I mean, I get it. The intellectual strains of criticism that arose around opera constantly had to negotiate with vocal trends and the reasons that particular shows were popular, versus what made it for them more than just lowbrow entertainment. This tension between ideals of dramatic storytelling and vocal athleticism arose as early as 1755, when Francesco Algarotti's Essay on the Opera criticized vocal performers for stepping outside the boundaries of proper storytelling in favor of vocal embellishments and over showmanship. In spite of all that connoisseurs may say of acting, the modern performers seem determined to attend to singing only, yet even in that, they do not observe the restrictions they should, knowing no other law but their own will and pleasure. Criticisms like Algarotti's grew in popularity, gaining widespread influence when championed by Christoph Gluck, whose reforms led to a new era of more austere, simplified opera with decreasingly flashy vocals, featuring text set in rhythm of actual speech and simpler, flowing melodic lines. Still, in the 19th century, Italian opera reasserted the role of the dominant vocalist via the bel canto movement. The bel canto movement basically returned the style to more intricate and demanding vocal lines. And incidentally, or not so incidentally because I wrote the script to end this section on this part, this was the operatic movement that had the most influence on early musical theater. And as a side note, relative to my existence and the fact that I have this career, this was also the era in which the vocal coach was sort of solidified as a known concept. A variety of essentially celebrity vocal coaches emerged out of the bel canto school, whose ways of conceptualizing vocal training would continue to be influential well into the 20th and 21st centuries. The influence of 19th century opera on early musical theater was partly mediated through the growing popularity of the operetta. The operetta was a form of light opera that reached the peak of its popularity during this time. Operettas featured symphonic music reminiscent of the operatic style of the time, with an increased focus on levity, shorter runtimes, and inclusions of sections of dialogue, all of which were clear precursors to elements of contemporary musical theater. Operettas drew in audiences that were perhaps less invested in the rigid forms of opera, but still wanted to see a good show. The operetta's success was relatively short-lived, as to my impression, the things that made it popular seemed to be done even better in early musical theater. Which leads us directly into the beginning of the musical theater era. Musical theater from the outset has been difficult to define. Stephen Sondheim, one of Broadway's most legendary composers and a huge influence on the medium, famously said, "I really think that when something plays on Broadway, it's a musical, and when it plays in an opera house, it's opera. That's it." Still, an argument could be made that musical theater by nature was more eclectic, allowing in, from its conception, a variety of popular forms of music. Before rock musicals and pop musicals like Jesus Christ Superstar began to dominate, musical theater had already dabbled in a wide variety of genres, from jazz to ragtime to folk. In the 21st century, pop and rock have increasingly dominated the landscape of musical theater. Crossover hits like Wicked, Hamilton, and Dear Evan Hansen produced songs that topped pop charts. Punk, hip-hop, salsa, and recently even metal have been integrated, sometimes in arguably watered-down ways, but that's a discussion for another day, into musical numbers on Broadway. Through it all, there's an argument that vocal demands on musical theater performers have been increasing. Anecdotally, my whole life, I had heard stories of big-name performers from the 90s and early 2000s blowing out their voices or destroying their careers. So to get at this question, I actually took a look at the sheet music of songs performed by lead actors in musicals from the 50s to now. And take this with a grain of salt, it's not a formal study, but it does look like the range and what's expected in terms of high notes has increased for leads over the decades. However, there is a catch, as most of this change is caused by leads performed by men. It seems like leading vocals have always been demanding for women in terms of range throughout Broadway history. It's just that during the early decades, men had a little bit of a break. So it could be that men, who have historically had an advantage when it comes to getting jobs and accolades on Broadway, have had to experience a little bit of what women have dealt with in terms of expectations for decades. Still, it's no secret that we are in an era that seems to elevate vocal athleticism and flashy vocals. Based on the history we looked at, it seems like there's been a tension there for centuries. Many critics and artists push back against vocals taking center stage in this art form, but audiences do seem to chase the high of just an out-of-control vocal performance. So now that we understand the way that these trends have evolved over the years, what do we make of all this? Why should we care about hard notes in musical theater at all? And why is this history relevant? As a vocal coach, I'm constantly reminded of the way in which this history still impacts how we talk about vocals today. It's created a lot of fascinating expectations and even myths around what makes proper vocals. An intense focus on proper technique seems to escalate during the early operatic era, and it has, within the subculture, largely persisted. What can be aggravating about this is that the idea of proper technique itself has historically been defined by a pretty niche subset of critics, artists, and composers. While vocal athleticism as a concept has probably been fascinating to us as humans from the beginning, the way that it's talked about in formal vocal training circles and musical theater discourse owes a lot to this history, for better and for worse. There's a problem here for me, which goes beyond the frustration that I experience when I still receive comments to this day saying that pop and rock singers are destroying their voices because they're not using operatic technique. There's an extra layer which is steeped in this Western Eurocentrism, which sets out a very specific standard for what vocal excellence looks like, and influences which forms of art we even talk about when we talk about vocal technique. In this way, for me, going back all the way to the beginning of the video, I think the genre bending movement in musical theater has largely benefited it. It's opened new doors for creativity while simultaneously eliciting these same conversations we've been having about the voice for centuries. I think that the threat to musical theater comes less from flashy vocals or showy performances or even outrageously high tenor notes than it does from a dearth of original materials, a focus on remakes and adaptations, and prohibitively expensive ticket prices that increase the demand for commercial viability. Ultimately, I think it's this demand, rather than a high ceiling for vocal technique, that really puts limits on the kind of shows that we're able to see and get produced. The role of mind-blowing vocals on Broadway, I think, is one that actually elevates the theater-going experience, and it's part of creating exhilarating performances. The ebb and flow of the emphasis on vocally demanding parts over the centuries indicates that there's always going to be room for other sorts of story. Innovations in genre bending can lead to technical demands or simply to new formats of telling musical stories. As a vocal coach, I'm invested in vocal athleticism as a quality that's worth pursuing. I can't coach somebody to be an incredible artist, but I can coach them to increase the tools in their vocal toolkit, which in my view ultimately gives them more options in terms of how they want to express their art. I will always be invested in seeing vocal freaks just do their thing, even if it's not to my taste. So, even if the question in the title can't be answered, let's keep asking. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing for more videos like this and other deep dives. I'm hoping to make my channel more than just a vocal technique channel, because I think there are so many layers that inform the work that we do as vocal coaches. So if you're interested in musical history, musical theater history, rock history, and of course vocal technique also, stick around. And as usual, if you're interested in working on your own voice, you can click the link in my bio for voice lessons and other resources. I'll see you in the next one.